great pleasure to initiate this year with our first lecturer, Mr. Garrison, who is the Alice Pratt Brown Distinguished Professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Trinity University. A more ample introduction to his work and research shall be done by my dear colleague, Mr. Carter. At the present, suffice it to say that his work is indeed revolutionary in ways more than one. Maybe just you would allow me to seize this opportunity to say a few words, general words, about the context of his work. Achaemenid history has been the domain of Iranian philology, but also of classical sources. Just recently, maybe the last 50, 60 years, have begun to introduce Elamite evidence into the lot, and that is inscribed administrative documents from the Persepolis archives that were discarded, written in the Elamite language and containing a host of information about the structure of the empire, the state of its religious landscape. And this information has allowed us to reevaluate greatly the early period of Achaemenid's history. Well, not only, as I mentioned, its religious landscape, but also its administrative structure, and also the origin of the Achaemenid Empire. Coming to realize that maybe these people are after all Persians, yes, but deeply acculturated with the Elamite element. However, the aspect that has been hitherto neglected has been the one on which Professor Garrison works. This is the glyptics of these tablets, and that is the seal impression captured on these Elamite tablets, the iconography thereupon, which by itself has a history to tell. And that is the interpretation of these images that allows us to reevaluate once more early Achaemenid history and think maybe that after all the Achaemenids are, yes indeed, very much acculturated people, but maybe had their own origins as well. Maybe they had an identity that is more specific and distinct to them than we had hitherto assumed, and I think that is what is looming ahead, namely a second renaissance in Achaemenid studies, which the work and the recent publication of Dr. Garrison is going to pave the way to bring about. So I think I have said already way too much and taken away from the more coherent approach of my colleague, Professor Carter, but I shall leave it up to her to make more ample introductions and better introductions. Would you please join me in making proper introductions to Professor Garrison's work?
More coherent, I don't know, but probably a little more personal, since I think I first saw Mark Garrison when he was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in the basement of the Oriental Institute and up on the 3rd floor, grinding his teeth over the heroic encounter, which was a subject of his dissertation and one of the key subjects of the seal impressions that he studies on these tablets. In the years that have passed, however, he has amply published many of these seal impressions, and he was telling us at lunch that now he's found 15 more examples, where before he had only 5, now he has 20. So it's like putting together this gigantic jigsaw puzzle in many ways. And now the outlines of that puzzle are coming to fruition. And in particular, his latest book on the sealings from Persepolis, which is available for free download on the University of Chicago Oriental Institute website, and you should add it to your library at once. But does not mean that it's not going to change, because he was telling us today at lunch that since 2008, he's been consistently working on these seals and sealings and dragging every possible bit of information out of them. And today he's going to talk on deities and rituals at Persepolis. And I'm sure that he has a nice subtitle, but it's how I could squeeze out of these tiny seal impressions some information on deities and rituals at Persepolis, because it's truly a great and devoted work that he's done on analyzing these very tiny artifacts and bringing them and integrating them into the larger world of Achaemenid history. Please welcome Mark Garrison.
Well, I'm not accustomed to getting two very elaborate and overwhelming introductions, and I thank you for them, and Rahim for the invitation to come here. You know, I'm at the age now where I sort of look back and I just marvel at how lucky, right? And every so often you just get lucky. Right? It doesn't have anything to do with sort of an intellectual level, or it has to do with being at a particular place at a particular moment in time. And I happen to be at a particular place, University of Michigan, at a particular moment in time when my advisor, Margaret Rood, was just beginning to look at this material from Persepolis. And I was about as raw a graduate student as ever came down the highway. And she took me and literally by the hand and kind of introduced me to this archive. And it was really an eye-opening experience for me, because I thought I knew what Achaemenid art looked like. And yet this material was nothing like what I had learned. So I basically had to unlearn Achaemenid art and begin to think about this material in new ways. So these are small administrative tablets. All three of these would fit into the palm of my hand. So they are very small, but I think even you can see from the back that these are beautiful, exceptional works of art. That is, on just a purely visual basis, this material is overwhelming. It's just in the sense that they are beautiful objects. They also happen to be intensively contextualized by the fact that they occur on these tablets. Now I'll be talking today about two archives of administrative tablets. Many of you in the room know a lot about this material, and so I apologize for kind of going over a little bit known territory here. The Fortification Archive, and these three tablets come from the Fortification Archive and the Treasury Archive. And the archives don't, interestingly, overlap chronologically. They sort of sequence each other. The archives are not exactly the same kind of, they don't record the same kind of information, but they are closely related. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details of it. Now, I think needs to be mentioned that you're looking on the right at these tablets with these seals that have been pressed on them. We don't have the seal matrices. Right? They don't exist for us at all. But that is in some ways a positive, in the sense that, of course, whenever we study seals today, we have to make an impression of them. Like this seal here, we could sort of make out what's going on, but on the cylinder seal here, you know, it's really hard. So that to study ancient seals, we have to make modern impressions of them anyway. It is unfortunate that sometimes the guys and girls who are sealing these tablets aren't really careful, and so that poses a little bit of a challenge. And today you will see the fact that we never, ever have a complete impression that shows you everything on an individual seal. So these are drawings of these seals. They're collated. So I was talking to Rahim, it's like a text that exists in multiple copies, and you've got to collate the text and put it together in a fabricated version. That is a version that doesn't exist in any one of the exemplars, but you take all the exemplars together and you create them. And this is one of the things that I do. So this, whoops, sorry. this is this seal here, this one is this one here, and this is this seal here. You will see a lot of different ways that we use to identify individual seals. It's very confusing, and I have no one to blame but myself for this thing, and so we won't worry about the seal numbers and the various sigla that are used. But no impression of these three seals preserves all of the information that you see in the collated drawings. And so today we'll work back and forth. It's important to see the original impressions, but you cannot get the full extent without having the collated image. And just to give you an idea, this is the most commonly occurring seal at Persepolis. It occurs on like 156 tablets and on multiple surfaces. So to put that drawing together, you have to look at about 550 impressions of the seal. Now obviously, a lot of them are just the same, but ever so often, right, you get this little bit that is new. So these archives were found at Persepolis. They were excavated by the Oriental Institute in the 1930s as part of their massive campaign to clear the terrace. The fortification archive was found in these little rooms right here. The Treasury archive was found in the Treasury. The fortification archive has nothing to do with walls or defense. It's simply the area from which the archive was found, so it's called the Fortification Archive today. The Treasury Archive actually has to do with movement of commodities and compensation for work under the direction of the Treasury. We today are going to focus almost exclusively on the Fortification Archive. The Treasury Archive was published back in the 1950s, the text in the 40s and 50s, and then also in the 60s, the seals in the 1950s, so that archive is well known. The Fortification Archive, less so. Just aerial photographs again to show you at the time of excavation, these little rooms for the Fortification Archive, the Treasury Archive scattered here. There's actually a third archive that was excavated not in the 1930s. It's a little bit different, and we won't really be talking about it here today. So the Fortification Archive, there are three kinds of text, or three kinds of documents. There's one document that is the most important, written in Elamite, and our understanding of the archive comes from these Elamite texts. There are also a collection of about 750 texts that are written in Aramaic. They're really hard to read, and they're really terse. And then there is another category of document that is a clay tablet, but it has no text on it, just seals, which is something that we get in the ancient Near East here and there, but never have we got a place where we have thousands of uninscribed documents. Their sole purpose apparently is to carry these seals. The Elamite texts help us see the structure of the whole system, and to no surprise, it's based on the road system, the famous road system that our classical sources talk about. And these are the major axes that emerge in the study of the Elamite texts. So literally all roads, of course, at Persepolis lead to Persepolis. There's a road to the north to Media, and of course Susa, and then to points farther west all the way to Sardis, to the east, into Arachosia in India, and then a smaller southern route that gets you down here. Now the tablets, the Elamite tablets themselves, are made in this area. That is, these are where the transactions are actually happening and being recorded, and eventually they make their way back to Persepolis where they're collated together. Now these Elamite texts come in two principal forms. One are these tongue-shaped text. Again, this would fit into the palm of my hand. And they record an individual transaction. So we call them memorandum or memoranda. And they are just basically either movements of agricultural commodities or livestock, or storage, or payment out to workers. And in some cases, they are wages paid to administrators as well. And then there are the compilations, the Halleck, who published the Elamite, a sample of the Elamite text in 1969, called them journals and accounts. And this is an example of actually an account, multiple years, sheep and goat, under the jurisdiction of a particular individual. So these two types of documents stand out, right? Even in fragments, you know whether you're looking at an account journal or a, or a memorandum. So The Treasury Archive, much smaller than the Fortification Archive, and there were 77 seals that were published that occur on those documents. As of last night, there are 3,649 distinct and legible seals that we've identified in the Fortification Archive. That is 3,649 works of art that are distinct and different from the other works of art. These are not the number of impressions, which of course number into the tens of thousands. It is staggering. And we have a student who, she's done for the day. She is processing about the remaining 2,500 tablets that have not been processed, that is the seal impressions on them. So every week we talk and she sends me a list of all the new seals, so that this number is already out of date, right? Because she's added to it. Where's the tipping point? Where do we reach an equilibrium where we're not getting, when we look at 10 texts, 15 new seals? We haven't even reached that point yet. Just again, as a point of comparison to just the density and the richness of this material, and I've made this comparison in a lot of venues and many of you have heard it before, but it's still, the Beasley Archive, which is a database that any of you can access online for the study of Greek vase painting. If you search for all of the vases in the Beasley Archive, and it's not all red figure vases that I've done this search for, but it's kind of the research corpus, as it were. For the years 525 to 475, you get 3,824. We will be almost to that number probably within 3 or 4 months. In other words, we will have at Persepolis, as a research corpus, dating to this very restricted period, more images or more individual works of art than there are for red figure vase painting over a 50-year period. This, by the way, is, I'm just showing you some really beautiful seals. This is the Derrick. Most of our seals are in fact seals, but this is a coin that's been impressed on it. It's well known, it has been published. It's the archival context that is the thing that so distinguishes this material, right? That is, this is not material that is just scattered, that are in museums. This material comes from these tablets, and these tablets come from a particular time, a particular place, right? Persepolis during the earlier years of the reign of Darius for the Fortification Archive. And that place is an imperial capital. I mean, we're not out in the boonies. This is the most important site probably in the whole of the Achaemenid world, Persepolis. Now, some of you may argue about that, but I obviously have a bias, exactly. So we don't have any of the problems of, well, we don't know the provenance of this, right? Is it real? Many of the seals I will show you today, you will, if they occurred on the art market, you say it's a forgery. That is, I mean, they're just so weird and strange and wonderful. This evidence is restricted in time, the reign of Darius, and space, the immediate environments of Persepolis that I showed you. Now, some of these seals predate the archive, and that's a whole very interesting and complicated discussion that we probably won't be able to have today. And this just happens to be just not any time, right? This is the most critical time in the formation of the Achaemenid Empire. This is the time when all the visual protocols are first established, when the courtly protocols are established. In other words, this is ground zero, this period, for the formation of the Achaemenid Empire, the largest, most powerful political entity the planet has ever seen. And our material comes from that place and at this particular moment. And again, you couldn't ask for, as an art historian, you could not ask for any more than all of this kind of contextual information. So there are so many things that need to be done just from a purely kind of art historical research project. And hopefully the work that we're doing will kind of provide a foundation so that future generations can do some of that. Today, we're going to look at some things that I got interested in. Not many, but maybe for a while, okay, a decade. I feel really old when I say that, but the topic of Achaemenid religion is a hotly contested topic. And if you've ever kind of waded into those, well, I'll step that back. If you've ever had the opportunity to enjoy the scholarship about Achaemenid religion, you know that it is a really difficult phenomenon. And the reason for this, which we're not going to go into today, is that in the imperial inscriptions, there is the mention of this god, Ahura Mazda, who most people relate to Ahura Mazda. And so there is a long tradition of saying, well, because we have the god Ahura Mazda, or Ahura Mazda, the Achaemenids were Zoroastrian, and so everything we think about, anything we find in the archaeological record, has to be viewed from a Zoroastrian perspective. That question is always going to be in the background today and whenever we're talking about it, but what I want to try to do today is just kind of step away from that and let's just look at the images and see kind of where they take us. Now, again, if you've wandered into the scholarship on Achaemenid religion, you will immediately encounter an entity that is generally identified as a representation of the god Ahura Mazda, and it's this entity that is the winged disc here, or the winged disc that has a half figure emerging out of it. It goes by a lot of different names. I'll just call it the winged symbol for ease of reference. And so the first thing that we have to do is just kind of unhinge, right, the automatic association, oh, this has to be the god Ahura Mazda. I'm not saying it's not in some context, but I say if we just kind of step back a little bit and ponder it. Now here's an interesting thing. This winged symbol in the scholarship is always sort of highlighted as one of the critical features of Achaemenid art. And certainly it occurs at Bisitun, and it occurs in Naqš-e Rostam, which we'll look at, and it occurs on some of the palaces at Persepolis. But in Achaemenid, in the fortification archive, in these 3,000 some odd tablets, we only have 115 seals that have this image. In other words, it is really, really rare at Persepolis at this time to see this particular image. What's also interesting about this image from the fortification archive is that it's much more active. That in the release, and we'll see some examples, the winged symbol there's this remove between the individual who may or may not be worshiping that winged symbol and the winged symbol itself. But we have many examples, as here, where the winged symbol is offering up an old theme, isn't it? The offering of the ring to the ruler or the whoever it may be. And then, of course, the text from the fortification archive, as Walter Hinkelmann, who also works on the archive, so brilliantly exposed in his work, his book from 2008, The Other Gods Who Are. These Elamite texts show us a religious landscape that is remarkably diverse. There are Elamite deities, Adad, Humbab, Naparisha. There are Iranian deities, including Ahura Mazda. There are some deities that we don't know whether they are Iranian or Elamite. There are offerings given to kind of amorphous entities, the gods, all the gods are for the gods, mountains, rivers, places, even temples get religious offerings. So what is so interesting is that the diversity of the religious landscape as revealed in the text, and these texts are just basically what happens ever so often is that the state will deliver commodities to a individual who then passes them on to one of these deities or to the people who are running those for purposes of religious offering. So that the diversity of the religious landscape as represented in the text is reflected in the material that we'll be talking about here today. What's also interesting about the winged symbol, because it is the one that is most often discussed, and I'll get out of it here in a minute, is that almost always at Persepolis, there are some exceptions, there are other entities that are shown with it. This is a beautiful impression. These are two different tablets, but now what a wonderful and interesting seal design. So this is carved in a local style of carving. I don't have time today to go into the various styles of carving that exist at Persepolis, but you can see that there is a crescent here. There is a star. Here's the figure with the wing holding the ring out again. And then below it, you might not easily recognize that unless you kind of looked at a lot of seals. That's the stylized tree. That is the Assyrian stylized tree. Here, perhaps you can see it better in this seal from Persepolis, where you have these bullmen who are holding aloft the figure in the winged disc. And here's the stylized tree. Note the star down here. I mean, I'm not even, well, what do you do with this? I mean, a double-headed lion human entity that is winged. And I think that there's some kind of exchange that is happening between the figure and the winged. Anyway, again, these are the kinds of things that you... So this kind of scene of the bullmen who hold aloft the winged symbol with the stylized tree. Here you see an impression from the late Babylonian archives at Uruk, and this an unprovenance seal now in the British Museum. This is an old theme that occurs in the, well, even earlier than Neo-Syrian, but mainly in the Neo-Syrian record. And one of the things for those of you who are familiar with Assyrian art is you're going to see a lot of Assyrianisms. And these are not old seals that are being reused, but this is the perpetuation of a lot of this Assyrian and, as we shall see, Babylonianizing imagery as well. Sometimes the identification of a deity is absolutely clear, right? In the traditional way of showing a figure in a nimbus, which indicates that this is a divine entity. And note again the Assyrianisms of the winged figures on either side who actually have buckets. They don't hold cones like the Assyrians one here. So one way that deities are shown. This is a seal that has often been published because it actually is the personal seal of one of the queens. Her name was Irtashduna. She's mentioned in our Greek sources. She evidently was the principal wife of Darius, and her son, Irshana, is also an important figure as well. And it sort of looks like a divine imagery on steroids, doesn't it? I mean, there is the Pleiades up here, this figure in a starred nimbus, the stylized plant here, crescent, Ram, and maybe Horus child. I don't know, the impressions are really poor. And either she or the person who sealed for her was an absolute mess. I mean, you see, the seal always is overrolled, and that's just the way it is, right? And one of the most important seals in the Holy Archive, it's really hard to get this. So this seal again looks very Assyrian, right? But it's not, right? There are lots of Assyrianisms in it, but it clearly is not Assyrian, either in style or other ways as well. This is a real Assyrian seal where you oftentimes get this kind of flood of imagery. We also have a lunar deity. These are two beautiful seals here, aren't they? Who is a half figure who rises up out of a crescent. And note again the bullman. So these bullmen are really important. They're again another inheritance from the Assyro-Babylonian tradition, and they are yet another way of indicating the divine, that you are in the divine or in a divine landscape or a numinous kind of environment. All right, now I have to be really careful. And my watch, alas, is on San Antonio time, so I'm completely confused as to, it's now 5:25, right? No, 4:25. Is that right? 4:30. Okay, so good. And what time did we start?
We started late.
We started late, okay. And then ever so often there's just something that emerges that is so confounding and so brilliantly executed, and yet we have no explanation for it. And this is we have lots of winged composite figures, but this one is particularly evocative, isn't it? So here we have the half figure, this time fully garbed out in the court garment, the Achaemenid court garment, shooting a bow and arrow, but he's rising up out of some kind of creature that has a bull's head, what looks like, I would assume, a fish body, a scorpion tail, and a wing. And look how the wing of the creature is melded into the lower garment of the archer here. So once you've seen, I think, hopefully, this entity, it really makes you rethink this entity. In other words, in the past, we've always thought, okay, this entity in the disk that floats, this is the famous one at Bisitun, is so distinct, and it must be this particular deity. But in fact, there are a whole range of entities that have the same kind of characteristics. That is, they hover, right? They are winged, they float. There is a half-figure humanoid that emerges from it. It's interesting, too, that this one directly engages with yet another vehicle of Achaemenid imperial ideology, the coinage, the famous coin types. The archer, this is the type 2 coin here. So this is a wonderful blending of a tradition that, of course, doesn't exist in the monumental record. Right? It's interesting, isn't it, that the killing of animals and the king as archer is such a dominant aspect of the Assyrian royal imagery, and yet it's not. We don't see it all in monumental art, but we do capture it in coins, and of course, and then you will have noticed that many of these, and I haven't talked very much about it, many of these seals that we've seen and we're going to see today have inscriptions on them. Those inscriptions are written in generally one of two languages, Elamite or Aramaic. We'll see examples of both. They are hard to read because they're really difficult to get the copies off of. The Aramaic is really, really hard. And they generally give a personal name, oftentimes with a patronymic, and sometimes in the Aramaic they will actually give a title as well. So I don't want to kind of overburden us today with trying to think about the inscriptions, but it's really interesting that, of course, one of the dominant features of the imperial monumental landscape is this melding of text and image. That is such a critical part of it. And I see that functioning in the same way. That is, text as both a deliverer of a message that maybe somebody could read, probably very few, and certainly none of them you could not, if you've been to Bisitun, no one can read anything, right? Even if you were fluent in Old Persian, Elamite, or Babylonian, because you can't see the text, right? That is, text as an aspect of the iconography of the imagery. Fishmen, another inheritance from the Assyro-Babylonian record, two beautiful, spectacular examples of how it is articulated at Persepolis. Let's look at each of these kind of individually and the impressions of them. So in this particular instance, right, these fish creatures that are partially humanoid are serving as pedestals for what we assume. This is certainly a crown figure here. You can capture a little bit in that, and probably here as well. And this is the dentate Achaemenid crown, which is very distinctive, right? I mean, this is not a old seal. This is clearly something that. But the elevation of the, we could call them attendants or worshippers on either side, and then the stylized tree and the figure in the winged disc as well. So this idea of elevation is really critical, and something that I think the glyptic from Persepolis has really allowed us to see more directly in monumental relief. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. That is, this idea of a worshipper who stands on top of a pedestal. This elevation signals that you're in a numinous, unworldly landscape at that particular moment. Naqš-e Rostam, the famous tomb relief of Darius, much discussed, although interestingly, Naqš-e Rostam is sort of shoved off to the side because Bisitun just consumes all the oxygen in the room because of the tradition of Bisitun as the first text in many ways from a Syriological, not literally I'm talking about, but that's the text anyway. So here, Darius, of course, is being elevated himself, isn't he? Right? That the figures below are elevating him. Here we can see in this, whoops, let me go back here. They're in this pose, that is the bullman pose that we've been seeing. Here's another seal from Persepolis. In the glyptic, they elevate the figure in the winged disc very often. This seal up above is a wonderful hybrid of Assyrianizing imagery, but it belongs to the guy who is the second in charge of the agency. His name is Zisharwish, and the Aramaic inscription actually says his name up there. So with that, in other words, this again is not a reused. although it has some Assyrian aspects to it. So in other words, these guys are elevating this guy, and that signals something, right? It's not just a photograph of an event that actually happened. The Atlantid figures, whether they are bullmen, I keep pressing the wrong button, whether they're bullmen or personifications of the land of the empire, signal that you are not in a regular environment. This is a numinous landscape to which you belong. And then hundreds and hundreds of examples of divine symbols that are just abstract. Right? So I'm talking here about the star and the crescent. Literally hundreds of every thematic type in Persepolis has one or both of these images in it. And speaking of of just sort of abstract symbols of the divine, one of the largest categories of scene type that we have for Persepolis is this scene type of a worshiper who stands before a pedestal on which there are these abstract symbols, in this case the double stylus and the spade of Marduk. It is a late Babylonian scene. It's a scene that occurs in late Babylonian context, and so oftentimes it's called the late Babylonian worship scene. But already in the 70s, Richard Zettler recognized that this scene type continues into the Achaemenid period, and indeed is being made in the Achaemenid period. And thus we have over 100 examples of this particular scene type at Persepolis. As in the Babylonian material, sometimes this scene type occurs on a cylinder seal. More often is on these little stamp seals, but sometimes you get really virtuosic examples of it. This seal, I'm not able to collate it, but in your mind, of course, you have to take the worshiper and put him over here in front of the pedestal on which there is a dragon, the Mushushu dragon. It's a beautifully executed seal. And of course, you're saying, well, no, they're not worshiping Marduk and Nabu, and no, because this is Persepolis, right? They're Zoroastrians, right? They don't worship this. But now, 3 kilometers to the west of the Taqt at Persepolis, right here in the Firuzi area, the Italian-Iranian archaeological project has excavated here at a place called Toli Ajori, a monumental gateway. Here's a picture from their photographs. This is a plan of the gate. I know it's hard to read, but it literally is a massive mud brick structure. Here's one side, and you walk in through it here. And it's massive, 39 meters by 29 meters, the size of this gate. 39 meters by 30 meters. It is a to-scale replica, as far as the Italians and the Iranians, of the Ishtar Gate at Babylon. Decorated like the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. In other words, you could stand on the Taqt at Persepolis, look out, and see the Ishtar Gate. Just to give you an example, the Gate of All Lands, the famous gateway on the Taqt at Persepolis, is basically 25 by 25. So this monument is much larger than it. In fact, it's really the same size as the Palace of Darius. This gate is the same size as the Palace of Darius. And it carries glazed brick decoration, just like the Ishtar Gate. And so here there's a Mushushu dragon, as reconstructed by the Italian-Iranian team. And they actually are able to use the brick dimensions and patterns of the Ishtar Gate to put the thing. That's how close of a copy. So it's almost like they went and they made they make a mold of the whole of the Ishtar Gate and brought it back and built. Here's another example of sort of a late Babylonian worship scene. Bull, lightning bolt. Of course, this has to be a Dod, right? We know this imagery from a Syro-Babylonian context. And again, you say, no, they don't worship a Dod, right? But there are the bulls from the Toli Ajori Gate, and even more importantly, texts that mention the worship of a Dod. This is text 351, Halleck published. an allocation from a guy, Achaemenid. He has given wine to this guy, Naqš. Naqš then used it, napina, for the gods. And then, even more specifically, he used it for the gods Adad and Humbang. So, yeah, they are worshiping Adad in the region of Persepolis. So, these late Babylonian worship scenes, an early photograph of as they're just beginning to expose the monumental gate at Toli-Ajuri, now moves us sort of from the topic of the representation of the divine to ritual space, right? Because these scenes and the monumental gateway take us to the literal landscape where ritual is happening. So here's I was telling you that we have a student who is making, identifying new seals on these unprocessed tablets. And so this is a drawing she sent me last week. So when we study them, the first thing we do when we get a tablet for the first time, we look, does this seal occur anywhere else? So you have to have a photographic memory of 3,649 seals in your head to know whether that's hard. So once you've gone through all 3,600, no, right, I mean, there are tricks. But anyway, once you say, okay, this is a new seal, then we make a little sketch drawing, and then eventually we'll go back and make a measured line drawing, which you've been looking at measured line drawings that are to scale. And this is Emma's sketch drawing of it. Good heavens, I mean, when she showed me this, I was like, are you sure that that is what you're seeing? And so I had to get the, a winged disc, an interesting one, has 4 wings. There's an attendant over here who's holding these vessels over another large pitcher, and then in between the wings, you can see it. Wait, is that here? There. And here's is another vessel. In other words, there's some kind of ritual. Now, we're not looking at the winged disc as this emblem, but now there's this kind of ritual engagement involving vessels, and one assumes libations. Oh my gosh. So we have a lot of interesting scenes, and now we're kind of moving into the book that on the ritual landscape, and so if you've seen it, then you've seen a lot of these. There is this structure that often occurs. It is, I call it the step structure. It's a little pedestal here, and then there are 3 steps, and there's a fire on it. And this step structure, what I call the step structure, is known in other seals that are outside of Persepolis. It's been known for many years. There aren't a lot of them. I think the catalog, there were like 15 that was known from the whole Achaemenid period. We have like 3 times that just from Persepolis. But nonetheless, it shows a fire on this thing, and previous scholars had identified these structures as a fire altar. Well, yeah, of course, because they're Zoroastrian, and so this is a holder for sacred fire that is being venerated as sacred fire. The vessels over it is a recurring theme in these kinds of scenes. Here again is the step structure, not as well preserved, just a little bit of the fire left. And there is a guy who is kneeling down next to an animal on its back, and he's butchering the animal. Here's another one, very fragmentary, but the attendant, the step structure, this is the fire here, a big mass thing, and then a table in which there are probably some kind of implements or something like that. So this step structure is easily readable. It's a kind of almost, we could call it iconic in the sense that we can read it as an icon. It looks like something that exists in the landscape, right? It always has a fire on it. The action is very readable. The individuals are oftentimes doing something near the fire, oftentimes involving a vessel. These scenes are, I say, they have a very high narrative quality, and they appear rooted in a realistic space. There's another structure that occurs in the glyptic at Persepolis, which also has been known outside of Persepolis and much discussed. It has a different shape. It oftentimes has a stepped kind of recession here. It is rectangular and very often has these kind of recessing. I call this the tower structure. And again, it has been traditionally interpreted as a fire altar, that is a holder for sacred fire that would be worshipped. This is a particularly brilliant example of these attendants who are decked out in royal finery. In other words, this is the king or kingship, and it also carries a trilingual royal name inscription that says, I am Darius, an old Persian Elamite. So this obviously is a hugely important seal, but of course it doesn't belong to Darius. It's being used by a very high-rank administrator. That's an interesting thing in and of itself. We don't have a lot of these kinds of scenes with that tower structure and the attendants on two sides. Here's another one. This time it carries an Aramaic inscription, just a personal name, and it looks like a title as well. But look at how different the structure is, right? It has a little podium, these zigzag things, and the proportions are different than the one that we just looked at. These seals, these types of scenes, are rare at Persepolis. They are very different in their dynamic, right? There's this kind of calm, static quality to them. They really remind you a lot of monumental relief, not only because of all of the heavy imperial court-centric iconography, but also just in the kind of calm, static quality. These things don't look real, right? Oh, look, this is the same person here, right? I mean, this is not, I don't think we're meant to read this as, okay, this is one person, and this is another person, and they both have crowns, and so this is the king and the prince or something. This is the same person seen in a panoptic perspective. In other words, we are magically transposed in this space to see him from both perspectives. And note how the handedness is so carefully articulated in that sense. In other words, this is a completely unreal scene. That is, we can't see from both directions. Sometimes the tower structure, only very poorly preserved here, individuals are leading animals to it. This one, figure here leading an animal, cut in the local style. And then sometimes you have the tower structure and people killing animals. And sometimes you have the tower structure and a seated figure interacting with an animal in some way. Now, this tower structure is a little bit different. The configuration of the top of it doesn't have that kind of step, but nonetheless there is still that same idea there. These tower structures admit of a lot of variety. Here, tower structure, seated figure, now vessels, holding these vessels, and the animal. Wow. And here's an example of a seal that if you saw this seal on the art market, you would say, this seal is clearly a forgery, right? I mean, there's nothing that you can kind of relate it to. Here's the tower structure here, this time with the winged symbol over it. And then look, there's this guy here, and he's got something he's holding between his hands. It almost looks like an offering, doesn't it? I mean, when I saw this, I almost said, is this an Uruk period seal? I mean, because there are these famous seals from the Uruk period where there are these processions with people who are holding these objects in it. And then is this, look, this is a figure on the back of a composite animal. Traditionally in Mesopotamia, this means the epiphany of the god, right? This is one way to show that you're actually dealing with the epiphany of the god. Or it is an offering itself, like a statue that is being just kind of remarkable, isn't it? Tower structure. End point of a procession, there's just a little bit of an animal. So there's probably another person here pushing, maybe two animals. And then the vessel up next to it. Here's another version of that with the with the structure. This guy's got a beautiful. This guy holding him up. Is he getting ready to kill that animal there? I don't know. So these kinds of scenes, right, where the tower structure is an endpoint of a procession of figures, oftentimes clearly are evoking the idea of sacrifice or offering, either animal sacrifice or liquid sacrifice. Never is there a fire shown on these structures, right? So these have nothing to do with fire, these structures. These scenes, like the ones we saw previously with just the step structure, are highly narrative, right? They're legible, easily legible, and we appear to be, in most times, a real place. And then what are 10, maybe there are 12 now seals, where we have the tower structure paired with the step structure and a procession of figures moving towards it. The figure closest to the step structure with the fire here, holding vessels, and this guy with literally the knife to the throat. Just one individual, tower structure, step structure, killing of animals. And just a magnificent kind of articulation of this idea, isn't it? With the tower structure, step structure. Here the attendant with a beautiful pitcher getting ready to pour into and then an attendant leading a calf. And one of the rare times that any of these scenes has actually got a divine symbol in it, a crescent. Wow. I mean, look at, when you first find this, and literally, so in Chicago, there are 2,500 some odd plastic boxes that just have tablets in them. And Halleck went through and pulled out the ones that he published or was going to work on, and then there were just thousands of more of them in there. And so I go, this is one of the things I do, I open the thing and I just pull out really beautiful seals. I mean, it's a pretty good job, right? I mean, but this one's just beautiful. Look at that step structure there and that blazing fire on it. Wow. And then these kinds of scenes, tower structure, step structure, and now a series of attendants in procession holding vessels, and their hands are up by their mouths, apparently covering their mouths. Here's another one. They look very similar. This obviously was oriented in a different direction. This one here, a beautiful structure here. Wow. So these kinds of scenes that we've just been looking at, again, emphasize this idea of a processional, that is a movement toward the paired stepped and tower structure. Always the step structure is in front of the tower structure from the movement of the figures. We get killing of animals, liquid libations. Interesting that never do we get court-centric iconography. That is, the dentate crown, the Persian court robe, the winged figure, date palms, all of that kind of stuff. These scenes that we've been looking at with the processions interface with these scenes in the sense that you have an attendant who is interacting with the fire in some way. They also interface with these kinds of scenes where you just have the tower structure that is a procession of figures moving with animals and holding vessels. And they interface also with these scenes which show animal sacrifice. Here, there. So it may be just too easy to do this, right? To say, all right, this is a ritual narrative that we have captured, that is the leading of the animal into the presence of these two structures, the killing of the animal, the pouring of the libations, and then afterward the butchery and, we want to assume, communal banquet. That is a very traditional Assyro-Babylonian ritual scene. Do you have time for Persepolis, or should we, or for Naqš-e Rostam?
Please go ahead.
You think? Okay. You sure that you want to do this? Okay. No, I'll be quick here. This material interacts with Naqš-e Rostam in so many ways, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about those. Now, of course, Naqš-e Rostam is the burial place of four of the Persian kings in these rock-cut tombs here, 13, 9, and 7. There's another one here. But at the base, there is this massive mound that needs to be excavated in a proper manner because it's a religious sanctuary. Without a doubt, this is an Achaemenid religious sanctuary. There's a famous tower here as well, which we'll get to in just a second here. Now, here is the facade of the tomb of Darius. A lot that needs to be said, but we'll just focus for a brief minute on this top scene here, which is what has been the focus of most commentary. In fact, now that we have been looking at these scenes from Persepolis, this scene seems much more complicated than it has traditionally. That is, Moses, okay, this is Darius worshiping fire. But in fact, there are some interesting relationships that are to be read horizontally this way, and also vertically. Right? There are some ways that the relief at Naqš-e Rostam interfaces directly with what we've been looking at, and in some places it's radically different. So that's a horrible photograph that we've been looking at, and this is a not so great drawing, but it's at least you can see a little bit better what we've got going on up here in this photograph. So there is a step structure at Naqš-e Rostam. This obviously is one of the reasons these step structures have been so intensively discussed, because they occur here in this particular important relief. But the step structure at Naqš-e Rostam, which this is a detailed drawing, is unique. No of the examples from Persepolis glyptic is like that. In other words, this is an oddity, this particular stepped structure. Right? It doesn't look like these or variations that we have, that we've seen. This Naqš-e Rostam also obviously is exceptional in comparison to the glyptic, because you've got all of this court-centric iconography. That is the special garment, the Darius holds a bow, he actually has a crenellated crown, the winged disc, etc. The inclusion of divine symbols, such as we have here with the disc in crescent and disc and the winged symbol, is very rare in the material from Persepolis. We saw the example there of seal 75. There are some similarities though, right? So Darius stands here. There's this kind of directionality, that is, Darius looks that way and engages with these entities over here, and that's a feature of the glyptic, this sense of direction, and the blazing fire on the step structure. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that this scene at Naqš-e Rostam really seems much more like this scene, doesn't it? I mean, just in kind of the visual qualities. Of course, you're overwhelmed a little bit by the court-centric iconography. And then once you get past that, you see that there, in fact, are some differences. But they share the same compositional dynamics. That is, the king or crown figure separate, distant, not any kind of direct interaction. And of course, inscriptions. Right? Now, what often happens is that because we are so interested in the king and the step structure, we forget that there's a lot of other things happening at Naqš-e Rostam. And again, the glyptic helps us wake up to see that. Right? So on these side panels here, there are these three figures. These two are often noted because they have inscriptions, and so that's how you can't see them in this particular photograph. But they balance, right? So you put these things, and now all of a sudden you've got this really interesting balance kind of dynamic. Because the photographs of the tomb of Darius are always so difficult, this is actually another tomb where you can see these attendants who are over here. The tombs are copies of the tombs of Darius. And yeah, and they have their hands up over their mouths. These guys would have as well, which is exactly what we saw in the glyptic. Now, there are wings as well, which again, you can't see in normal photographs, because you have to imagine, like, if this is the rock face, the tomb facade has been cut back into it, and there are these wings. And on the right, there are these figures here who also have their hands over their mouths. This is just a detail of it that you can see. Right? So it's interesting that the two wings are unbalanced. On the left, there are four figures. The tomb of Darius is the only one that has four. And they hold weapons. In fact, all of the guys on the left have weapons, and those on the right are in this particular pose. So this hand over mouth gesture, which because of our Zoroastrian frame has always been read as well, the fire has to be protected. Right? You can't breathe on the sacred fire. But in fact, it occurs in a lot of different contexts, right? Oftentimes directly in the presence of the kings, like the famous central panel from one of the Apadana stairways. Also door jambs. And here at Persepolis in these processional scenes. So I think that because of these things, that is, this overwhelming sense of procession, movement towards the step structure and the tower structure, that these guys on the right who are in this pose that we see here overwhelmingly make us want to connect that. That is, from the perspective of the viewer who is familiar with this, that we are looking at a procession towards some kind of religious context. That is, from the right-hand side over here, right? So that these attendants on the right-hand side here and on the wings here are not standing before the king, but they're in fact moving towards him in some kind of ritual procession. This then really makes Naqš-e Rostam parallel what we see in the Apadana, right? That is a procession on the right-hand side, moving towards a central panel. This is the one that was moved, so you've got to magically transpose it. And then attendants with weapons on the left. From the perspective of the processional, the king is in a highly charged numinous space. Crescent and disk, step structure, winged symbol, and then the king. In fact, the king is doubly projected into this numinous space, isn't he? Not only through this way, but these associations here. That is, the Atlantid poses, the uplifting. So literally the king from two perspectives is pushed into this numinous space. In other words, we must leave open the option, right, that we are supposed to understand this in this way. That is, the king is divine. Lastly, we draw back even farther to the whole of the landscape of Naqš-e Rostam. Here's our guys here looking across this, and then we have the famous tower, the Kavita Zardush. Does the tower, the actual tower at Naqš-e Rostam, play the same function as the towers in these scenes, that is acting as a backdrop to the processional towards the stepped structure? I think that a case, and I've tried to make a case that in fact that is so. But of course what we're seeing as we move from this to this whole ritual landscape is an expansion and reformulation of this. That is, the processional scenes in glyptic, attendants with hands over the mouth, step structure, tower structure. Naqš-e Rostam, attendants with hands over the mouth, step structure, plus divine symbols, plus the king, and then in the background, the Kavai Zardush. I am not saying that these are that. I'm saying that this is part of a complex set of images that are representing something that is similar, not unique in the ritual landscape. There are towers all over, I bet. They've just found a huge one at Tolia Jori. So this gives us, I think, insight into how this new imperial formation in the visual arts comes about. We can kind of see the mechanics that are taking place. And this new imperial milieu, as it were, of course, emphasizes the king. Right? There's this scene type, but now the king is inserted into this and completely restructures it in many ways. And it reminds, that process reminds me a lot of what we see in other monuments that are highly charged products of imperial ideology, the most famous of which is the Victory Stele of Naram Sin, which we don't have time today to talk about in detail, but this is a reformulation of a traditional type of scene, but now with that king front and center. You guys have been awfully patient, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Animal satisfied to give. For in a different time zone, would they worship, fire worship here, or it was more or less same period?
So, this is a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, excuse me. I guess I would say that we're not seeing fire worship. Right? So in other words, I would say the idea of fire worship, we've been led astray by our insistence in viewing the Achaemenid material through this rigid Zoroastrian perspective. Now, Boyce, Mary Boyce, who of course was the founding figure in this line of argumentation, thought that the Zoroastrianism that she encountered in that living landscape of Iran, and she of course herself was a believer, she argued that that religious tradition that she saw firsthand was unchanged from the Achaemenid period. Now, just that as a supposition is highly, I think, problematic. And this again all has to do with how do we use the Avestan material? Right? How do we take the Avestan material and the Sasanian material and do we project it back to the Achaemenid period? And I guess what I'm suggesting is that let's look at just what the Achaemenid period has to tell us about. Clearly there is a deity, Ahura Mazda. In the kind of lived religious landscape, that deity is no different than any other deity. And so then you say, well, but here on the monumental relief is almost the only deity that is mentioned. So something is happening as part of this repackaging that I've tried to talk about here. And other people, including Wolter and some other scholars, have noticed that this highlighting of Ahura Mazda in the monumental register, that is, it's literally, and also just kind of if you think about it from a musical perspective, a whole different register of communication. We're seeing the same phenomenon that we'd see in earlier periods with Humbam and Ashur. The elevation of one deity to the level of kind of a state god. Does that mean that Ahura Mazda is the same Ahura Mazda that Mary Boyce knew and encountered? I don't think so. Do the scenes that we've been looking at where there's this person interacting with fire, is that fire worship? Or is that just the normal way that the ancients, that is fire as a way of communication where you pour stuff into it and you burn offerings to it and you... Now, of course, there is, in modern Zoroastrianism, animal sacrifice, right? So that in and of itself is not a thing that says, no, they're not. So it's a really kind of complicated issue that involves how do we deal with texts that are disjointed in time and space from our original material? And since so many people have taken those texts that are disjointed in time and space and tried to apply them, what I'm trying to do is push back a bit and say, let's look at what we actually have from that period. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Somehow I get it.
You think? Okay.
I hope.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your talk. My question is about seals as evidence for people's actual religious convictions as opposed to just artistic style. Maybe first a point of clarification. There was a seal where there's an inscription that says, I am Darius, being used by a functionary who's not in fact Darius the king. So given that we have one seal that makes a claim about the user of the seal, which isn't actually true, why would the religious iconography necessarily tell us anything about what the functionary or administrator actually believed? That is to say, maybe they're just drawing on a visual language handed down by a monarch that doesn't really tell you very much about their lived experience of religion. Isn't it possible for someone to draw on the religious language, the visual language of a religion without actually believing in it? A couple of years ago, 1 or 2 years I think, there was a gala at the Met where the theme was the Byzantine world, and celebrities showed up dressed as Byzantine saints and this kind of thing, but I would venture to guess that not too many of them were actually members of the Eastern Orthodox Church.
So there are a lot of questions there. Maybe I could tackle the easiest one for me, which is the seal of Shashawish that has the royal name inscription on it. So we have 5 of those seals. That is 5 royal name seals from that in the archive that say "I am Darius" in trilingual inscriptions. And then there are 8 that are from the Treasury archive. Or sorry, 5 that say Darius, and then 3 that say Xerxes. Right? So clearly these are not the personal seals of the king. And what I have argued that at least in its earliest phase, that these inscriptions, so that seal is in many ways kind of unique because it's the second seal that Xishawish uses. His first seal is seal 83, the one that had the cow and calf worshiping with and he uses that seal up until the year 502, and then in 502 he starts using this seal. His earlier seal had his name on it. This seal has the king's name on it. And in the year 502, we begin to get these royal name seals. So I think that these royal name seals are a special kind of phenomenon where the inscription is not to indicate that this is the person who's using the seal, as Xishawish's first seal, which has his name on it, but these are obviously highly charged ideological documents, right? They're very, very large. They probably are made of precious materials, lapis or gold. In other words, just as an object of status, they stand out. They would have stood out without even looking at the imagery on them. And the inscription, I have argued, on those seals is kind of the seal on the seal. That is, so Darius institutes a massive propaganda campaign in multiple media. Monumental relief, Bisitun, Naqš-e Rostam, Susa, and Persepolis that we know of. Glyptic, the 4 imperial coinage types, certainly the first 3 under his, and then, coinage and then glyptic. And these seals that have royal name inscriptions are, I've argued, although we don't have the manual that says it, that they are the things that are saying, okay, this is now what the world looks like. Then, in other words, they are the statement of what imperial glyptic is going to look at like. And so they're being handed out as special tokens as part of the both what I've argued is a kind of reformulation of a relationship between the king and these high-rank administrators that are happening in the late 6th century. So those seals are, I think we have to kind of put them aside because they are special, and I think that they're doing a lot of things other than that. Now, yeah, of course. One can argue that, for instance, someone who is using a seal that has bullmen holding aloft a winged figure with a stylized tree, we have no insight into what that person's individual belief is. And indeed, I think that would be a horrible use of glyptic material to try to say, okay, Xishawish's first seal shows a bullman holding aloft a winged symbol, and so that means that Xishawish is a Zoroastrian. No, we wouldn't. What I am trying to argue is that we are capturing in these the ritual space, that is the kind of mechanics of ritual space, regardless of whether it is for this deity or that deity or this deity. And whether or not the individual using the seal has any kind of emotional connection to those scenes, for me, it doesn't matter, right? I'm interested in what these images can provide by way of helping us understand better this particular question of the ritual space.
Mark, thank you
Hi,
so
Sarah.
much. Thank you so much. As someone who also knew you as a graduate student when you started on this long and challenging journey, it's really exciting to see what your research has produced and helped us understand about Persian religion and the use of the sealings on these tablets. I have one very basic question, which is how, this is something that, you know, non-specialists always ask, what's the effect of, is there a numinous authority that's given to the tablets and the texts themselves, which are the main reason, of course, they've been made, that involves having divine signs on them? Does that
increase the authority of the governing body, the imperial presence, whatever, that has given that to him. And of course, we've been looking at thousands of sealings, so, and the texts are a different matter, but just sort of how this keeps them from being, you know, they can't be altered, right? They have recorded something. So it's more a question of the relationship between the sealings and the text. But I also have more of an invitation, actually, to Ali Musavi, because we've heard all about this wonderful tower that he's been working at in Persepolis, and we're always asking about it. And I don't know what the relationship is between those kinds of towers and the towers that appear over and over again in these scenes. So you can forget my first question. And
well, no, the first question is very, so there are just these very narrow category of texts that talk about religious, and in comparison to all the other texts,
I realize most of them are economic
right,
commodities,
right, and never is there this kind of, as far as I can tell, any kind of relationship between the people that we can associate with the seals and the images that are shown on, yeah.
What's the power, what's the symbolic effect of using these particular sealings? If there's already the name of an authority who has authorized this payment, or...
Oh, so you're talking about just literally why apply a seal to a tablet at all?
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
That's always what people who are non-Spanish.
Okay, sorry, yes, great. Well, you know, that's, so I have some ideas about
Is it to protect them or to protect the transaction?
No, I do think that they have, in fact, they clearly have an administrative purpose, in the sense that very often, like, we know what seal belongs to what administrator, and that seal is applied to a tablet, but that administrator is not mentioned in the text. In other words, the seal adds information to the transaction.
Like a signature.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, because we also, their linear B tablets also are sometimes involved with sealings and what's the relationship between them in terms of understanding palatial administration.
Yeah. So those.
It's very basic and.
No. But there are many times, of course, that we're stumped, right, by that, and there are these special kinds of very large category of transaction that are payments to guys traveling on the royal road, and there they always seal with the supplier seal on one place and the receiver seal on another. So it's like beautiful. Thank God that they follow that protocol. Yeah.
I was thinking of the Darius seal again, and I'm wondering if you could draw an analogy to the Mesopotamian practice of the ruler giving a seal to someone to use.
Well, yeah,
and there's a whole category of so-and-so is his servant. Yeah. Here, they just forgot that part of it. They used the real name.
Yeah, there's a long tradition, and thank you for bringing that up, of that kind of thing. And of course, Irene Winter has written very eloquently about the Ur-3 phenomenon, where you have a similar kind of thing. So, that I've kind of set out all of that argumentation in that article for Matt's Festschrift. So, yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's not a crazy idea. I mean, there are examples of it from earlier periods.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I noticed a lot of iconography on these seals, similar to certain architectural elements from Persepolis, specifically the bulls with the two heads that kind of share the body. What's the connection here? How does our understanding of the glyptic kind of increase our understanding of what these architectural symbols mean?
That's a great question. I spent a long time in the book talking about that, because it's a really difficult and complicated phenomenon, and I can't say that I've got it all completely sorted out in my own mind. But, for instance, the seal that you're mentioning with the bulls, the adjoined fifth, they act as pedestals, right? So that is either worshippers stand on top of them, or the winged disc stands on top of them. And so I've talked a little bit about how we have the same kinds of dynamics happening at Persepolis, right? So there's this massive terrace that, first of all, lifts up the architecture, and then the buildings themselves stand on their own podia, and then the columns are up and they end in those bull's heads. So in other words, I've argued that it's the same dynamic, right? That this is, in some ways, I don't know, I think Ali might agree with this a little bit, that it is a kind of numinous, the terrace is a kind of numinous landscape. Would you agree or disagree?
Yes, in a way, yeah. Yeah, you're right. And we have those structures that Tilia discovered. And they look like
the horns.
Some of your some of your structures like those we saw on the you're right, you're absolutely, I agree with that.
And then so the tower structure is really the step structure is easy. They're all the same. They easily explain. The tower structure is much more difficult. There's more variety. So what I argued, and if any of you want to talk about this some more, it would be much appreciated. I've argued that those tower structures like you see here are not iconic. That is, they're not functioning in the sense of Perse's icon. That is, a image that derives its principal function from replicating what actually exists in space, which I think the step structures do that. The tower structures, I've tried to argue, are more indexical. That is, they're pointing to maybe classes of things. That is, they're not pointing to a specific, that is, they're not pointing to the tower at Naqš-e Rostam. And I sort of hedge my bets a little bit and bringing in the horns that Ali mentioned, that they may be referencing in some kind of very general way just monumental architecture as part of a critical apparatus of how this ritual landscape functions. And I have a little, with Toliajori, there's that the monument that is supposedly the tomb of Cambyses, or that may have very well been a tower as well, as far as we know. In other words, the whole of the terrace may have been circled by towers. I think Toliajori just makes us say anything is possible. If you can have the Ishtar Gate on the doorstep of Persepolis, anything is possible, isn't it? I think so.
Thank you so much. Just a small comment for some of our audience might not be entirely aware of the problematics of that. I just wanted to maybe provide a certain clarification that the Achaemenid inscriptions provide an idea about a certain supremacy of a god called Ahura Mazda, and this god indeed seems to be the same as the one that we find in other scriptures of the ancient Iranian that we cannot really date that well or localize, but so the Zoroastrian scriptures older than these inscriptions, where obviously we have the Zoroastrian faith in its and its credo and its rituals described to us. Now, this Ahura Mazda seems to be the same god. The question is that, unlike these inscriptions, the religious practice of the Achaemenids, as represented in the administrative text, in the Elam motifs, as well as the glyptics, reflect a different picture than the inscriptions. They don't have a concentration of worship around one god and maybe to subaltern god, but basically the whole plethora of gods of the empire are being worshipped. Among them Elamite gods, Babylonian gods, etc. And the entire problem is how to reconcile these two evidence. The evidence of the inscriptions that are very much in tune with what you know from Zoroastrianism, and the evidence from these Elamite tablets that show an empire at work in its religious exercise, worshipping basically the gods of the empire altogether. Now, the glyptic is its latest addition in our trying to determine this. And as far as I can tell, it provides ammunition to both camps. Again, it's to me at least, and I don't know what Stephanie you think, there is no problem in interpreting these stepstones as fires, and the animals and the libations as being perfectly Zoroastrian libations and sacrifices. I have no urge separating this matter from what I know from Zoroastrianism, and I don't try to impress those notions on that. But I think we should also not go the entirely opposite way, not to try to see anything that we know from before in these inscriptions or in these glyptics as well. There are many scenes that we can easily reconcile with practices that we know from Zoroastrianism without even trying to impress it upon the material. So it is good to look at these pictures and independently and say there is an Achaemenid religion, or religions maybe, but you should also not lead it to the extreme by trying to see nothing Zoroastrian in that, if there is anything of the sort.
Yeah. So the problem I have is that because, I mean, there are so many different definitions of what Zoroastrianism is. In other words, does it have animal sacrifice or doesn't it have animal sacrifice? Are you allowed to put certain things in the fire, or are you not allowed to put certain things in the fire? So from someone who is not, I just don't know, what do I use as the, okay, this is what I'm going, this is Zoroastrianism. These are the things that account, these are the things that we should be looking for. And if these other things, they're not, right? So, for instance, Boyce, right, refused to believe that the step structures in seals were fire altars, because she felt that the individual needed to be seated on the ground in order for it to be a proper Zoroastrian ritual. So you see, there's the problem. What are you going to, how are you going to define Zoroastrianism? Is it going to, from what text, or are you just going to take everything from the Sasanian period onto the modern period and say, this is Zoroastrianism, and just then pick whatever you want? That's my, if someone could tell me the answer to that, I would.
Would you like to give them an answer?
I don't really have an answer, but certainly the Avesta doesn't give us the kind of information that we would need, and the Avesta is going to be the set of texts that would predate this. So I think, Boyce and her, sort of like extremely inclusive, shall we say, way of approaching this is not the person that we, or the way we want to follow. And so, but I don't see any problem also with that thinking, okay, the royal tradition comes out of an Indo-Iranian linguistic tradition, and so maybe we have people who are, Ahura Mazda worshippers at the top of the heap, but the whole rest of the empire is more diverse, as we would say.
Right, of course, yeah, but we're at Persepolis. I mean, the deal is we're at Persepolis with all of this material. We're not in Anatolia or Egypt where there are these.
Yes, and there is also not, the game is not also Mary Boyce or nothing else. It means,
of course not.
Even Iranian studies has moved beyond that. So by this time we know that some of the texts that we might consult more would have been probably the younger Avesta, which would really be chronologically closer and linguistically closer to these texts, and also ritually. And now we have also fully established that the Avesta, as we have it, is a ritual text. It's basically a text. It's a long collection of rituals, so basically recitals of rituals. So it is basically, well, it is at least.
And here we get to the root of the problem. What does the Avesta say? Yeah, I mean, that is a.
Well, but short of Professor Jamison, I think that maybe some others do it.
Well, no, but let me just say that you're absolutely right, and I don't mean.
I agree that the young Avesta is a text of reference because it is chronologically closer. Thank you.
I mean, clearly Ahura Mazda is in the Elamite text as well, and so that is a deity, and so the question just becomes, what is the nature of that Mazda worship? What does it look like in the late 6th century? Where do we go to say, okay, this looks like this that we have from this period, or it looks like this that we have from this period? And I would welcome anyone who could help me, or any of us kind of sort, I mean, because that is the
Avesta is not in an imperial context. And so whatever, the Zoroastrianism, if we want to use what I would say, is kind of out of chronology, is going to be put to use in this new imperial context. So I don't think that we can use the Avesta as something from which we can read the way the Achaemenids were using this kind of material. I mean, I would go, I'm more sort of inclined to the direction that, yes, Ahura Mazda and Zoroastrian stuff is being used, but you can't reuse the Avesta as a source book for how that was being used.
And I would agree, yeah, with that we've got, clearly there's some kind of Mazda worshiping happening. And also, clearly, there is a reformulation going on in the late 6th century, and the isolation of Ahura Mazda literally in the imperial text is part of that.
Also, I mean, we have nothing visual from the Avesta, so there's no reason to believe that the winged disc thing is, an Avesta borrowing. I mean,
we don't need that.
Yeah, we don't need that.
So you just exemplified exactly what the problem is. So any more questions then, please? I think maybe Ali, you have been invited to comment on.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Because he made some interesting discoveries in Façade, especially the sacrificial
fire altar.
Yeah, fire altar, and then the bones that you found.
The bones, yeah.
If you can please elaborate on that.
Yeah, just a little bit, and I'd like to ask Mark what he thinks about the tower at Persepolis. We discovered a mud brick fire altar with the remains of its very last ritual, maybe ceremony, and thousands of bones, broken and burnt bones of young goat and sheep were consumed in that fire sort of pit. And we also just found a sort of broken blade in iron that was probably used to butcher or kill the animals. 30 kilos of bones.
Wow.
And you can match it with one of the texts from Persepolis. I got in touch with Walter Hinkelmann, and there's 2255 or 5522, I don't remember exactly the number, but he sent me the text about, it's a letter that they send ship and go to Persepolis.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do you think about that tower, the sort of stone steps at Persepolis that they call fire altar?
You mean in the sanctuary, okay, yeah.
Yeah, how do you relate that to?
I mean,
in front of Naqš-e Rostam, yeah.
Those towers are just so difficult. I mean, I don't know what to do with them. I mean, I think Naqš-e Rostam has to be a religious space. That is the base at the base. And so that means that tower, at least, has some kind of significance within that context, right? But what is all that stuff that they have found behind the tower at Persepolis? This massive complex.
You're excavating there, yeah. Actually, yeah. And it's difficult to see what it is actually. We have carbon dating for a few days. There's one from the the mud brick fire altar that gives us an early Achaemenid, if not pre-Achaemenid date. And I think that those small steps, at least one of them with steps, is the small tower and not a fire altar.
Can I ask you, I used to provide the dating for the bones? I think that
the dating for the bones falls between 600 and 450, with peak around 550 or so. So it's quite early. And the mud brick structure, or the fire altar, after they finished it, they carefully sealed it with bricks. So that was the end of it.
So it's like the tower at Naqsh-e then.
Yeah. So it's complicated.
any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.